They never knew who they were dealing with. And that's exactly how I planned it. Before I tell you what happened the night my son-in-law stood up at that dinner table and said what he said, the night everything shifted, I need you to understand something about me first. Because if you don't know who I am, none of what I did will make any sense. And some people, when they hear this story, they're going to say, I went too far. They're going to say a mother, a grandmother, shouldn't have done what I did. But those people don't know what it cost me to get there, and they don't know what I was willing to lose to finally have my dignity back. My name is Lorraine. I am 63 years old. I live alone now, in a one-bedroom apartment on the second floor of a building I chose myself, with a balcony that gets afternoon light and a kitchen that smells like whatever I feel like cooking that day. I have a savings account, a paid-off car, and the best sleep of my life. I didn't always have any of those things, not the peace, not the sleep, not the sense that my life belonged to me. For almost 8 years, I handed pieces of myself over to people who never once said thank you. And I did it willingly, because the person I was doing it for was my daughter, Noelle, my only child. I had Noelle when I was 26, just me and her from the beginning. Her father left before she was 2, and I made a decision right then that I was not going to let that define her childhood. So I worked. Lord, did I work. I did billing at a medical office during the day and cleaned offices 3 nights a week until Noelle was in middle school. We didn't take vacations, we didn't have new furniture, but she had a stable home, she had school supplies every September, and she knew, I made sure she knew, that she was loved completely. When Noelle got into college, I cried in the parking lot of my job. Full, ugly cry. Because it meant something I had worked toward for 20 years was actually real. She was going to have options I never had. I paid what I could toward her tuition. I took out a small personal loan to cover what financial aid didn't. I did not once complain about it. She graduated. She got a job at a logistics company downtown. And then, at 27, she met Garrett. I want to be fair here because I've had enough time to think about this clearly. Garrett was not a bad-looking man. He was 31 when they met, worked in sales, wore nice clothes. He had what I can only describe as the energy of someone who needed to be the most important person in every room. He shook my hand the first time we met and said, "Noelle talks about you constantly," with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I noticed. I filed it away. I tried to like him. I genuinely did. For the first year, I kept my thoughts to myself. When Noelle called me excited, I was excited with her. When she said he made her feel like a priority, I told her that's how it should be. I wasn't going to be the mother who poisoned her daughter's happiness based on a feeling I couldn't prove. They got engaged after 14 months. I helped pay for the wedding. $18,000 I had saved carefully over several years. Money I had planned to use eventually as a cushion for retirement, and I gave it to my daughter because she wanted a real celebration and I wanted to give her that. I told myself I'd rebuild the savings. I was only 55 at the time. I had time. The wedding was beautiful. I sat in the front row and I watched my daughter walk toward a future she had chosen, and I kept my face composed the entire ceremony, even though something in my chest felt uneasy. Something I couldn't name. After the wedding, things changed. Not all at once. That's how these things work. Slowly, in ways that are easy to explain away. The Sunday dinner stopped first. Noelle and I had always done Sunday dinners. Even when she moved out at 22, she'd come over, or I'd go to her apartment, and we'd sit and talk for hours. After the wedding, it became every other Sunday. Then once a month. Then the calls got shorter. I'd ask how she was doing, and she'd say, "Fine, tired, busy." I'd ask about coming to visit and she'd say, "Let me check with Garrett. I'll get back to you." I started driving to their house. They had bought a house the year after the wedding, a 4-bedroom colonial in a suburb about 40 minutes from me. I should tell you, I helped with that too. Not the mortgage itself, but the down payment. $22,000. I gave it to them because Noelle said they were $12,000 short and could I help with just some of it, and I gave her everything I had available at the time plus what I borrowed against my 401k. I remember standing in my kitchen after I transferred the money, looking at my account balance, and telling myself this is what mothers do. This is what love looks like in practice. I am not telling you this for sympathy. I am telling you this so you understand exactly what the foundation was and exactly what was built on top of it. When I visited the house, Garrett would be polite in the way that people are polite when they're tolerating something. He'd nod at me. He'd answer my questions with 3 words. He'd disappear into his office 30 minutes after I arrived and not come back out. Noelle would apologize quietly. He's tired. He had a long week, you know how he is? And I would sit in the living room of a house that existed partly because of me and feel like a stranger. The first time Garrett said something that crossed a real line, we were at their kitchen table. It was a Saturday afternoon, about 2 years into the marriage. I had brought over a pot of gumbo. I make a good gumbo, I always have, and set it on the stove to warm up. Garrett walked in, looked at the pot, and said to Noelle, loud enough for me to hear, "I told you I wanted to order out tonight." Noelle looked at me. I looked at me hands. She said, "We can still order something. I'll just put this in the fridge." He said, "I don't know why we need all this," and he walked back out. I took my pot and I drove home. I cried most of the way. Not because of the gumbo, because I had watched my daughter not say a word. I want you to sit with that for a second. Because that was the moment I should have spoken up. I've thought about it many times since. If I had said something then, to Noelle, privately, gently, maybe the next 6 years would have looked different. But I was afraid that pushing would push her away, afraid that being the difficult mother-in-law was a role I couldn't come back from. So I kept showing up. I kept bringing food she never ate in front of me. I kept offering to babysit when their daughter, my granddaughter Bea, was born 2 years in. Bea was the light of everything. She has Noelle's eyes, and this way of tilting her head when she's listening to you, that makes you feel like the most important person alive. I showed up for Bea because Bea needed me, and because being with her was the only time I felt like I belonged in that house. Garrett tolerated my presence when it served them. When they needed me to watch Bea for a long weekend while they went to Savannah, I was available. When Noelle called me crying because a pipe burst and Garrett was traveling and she needed help, I was there within the hour. When they had Garrett's colleagues over for dinner and needed someone to take Bea for the night, I came and picked her up and brought her back with her hair done and her little overnight bag packed. I was useful. I was just never welcome. There was a Christmas, about 4 years in, where I drove 40 minutes in the rain to bring Bea her gifts and have dinner. I had cooked sweet potato pie from scratch. When I arrived, Garrett's mother and sister were already there, set up in the living room, gifts opened, dinner half-eaten. Noelle had forgotten. She said she thought we'd said the following day. I stood in the doorway holding a pie and a bag of wrapped presents, and I looked at my daughter's face, and I saw something there that I had not let myself see before. She was not going to choose me, not in any moment that mattered. I drove home. I ate my sweet potato pie alone at my kitchen table on Christmas evening. And something in me went quiet in a way that felt permanent. After that, I started paying attention differently, not looking for reasons to be hurt. I was past that. I was looking at the structure of things. Who owned what? What was in whose name? what I had given and what I could technically take back. Here is what I knew: the down payment I had contributed to their house. I had never put that in writing as a gift. I had transferred the money from my account to Noelle's personal account, not a joint account, not directly to escrow, which meant legally it could be argued as a loan. I hadn't thought of it that way when I gave it, but I thought about it that way now. I also knew that for the past 2 years, I had been paying for Bea's preschool tuition directly, $1,400 a month, because Noelle had asked me to help while they were catching up on some credit card debt. I had never asked for anything in return, but the payments had come from my account, and I had every statement. I am not a woman who plots. I want to be clear about that. What I did was not revenge planned in the dark. It was a woman finally deciding that the love she had been giving away at a steep discount deserved to come home. The night it broke open was a Sunday in October. Noelle had invited me to dinner. Actually invited me. Which was unusual enough that I pressed my good blouse and drove over feeling cautiously hopeful. Gareth's brother was there, a man named Phil who I had met twice and found equally unpleasant both times. There were a few of their friends, a couple I didn't recognize. I sat down and felt immediately that I was not seated the way a guest of honor sits. I was seated the way you seat someone you couldn't quite not invite. Dinner went fine at first. I talked to one of the women across from me who was kind and asked about my work. I had retired from hospital administration the year before and was doing some part-time consulting, which I found genuinely fulfilling. She seemed interested. I felt normal for a few minutes. Then Gareth started talking about money. This was his favorite subject when he had a drink or two in him. What he'd invested in, what was performing, what his buddy had made flipping properties. I kept my eyes on my plate. He mentioned that they were looking at refinancing the house, pulling out some equity, maybe doing a renovation. And then Phil said, "Didn't you get a big chunk from somewhere for the down payment? Wasn't that your mom?" He looked at me when he said, "Your mom." The table got slightly quieter. Gareth said, "Yeah, we had some help." The way he said it, some help, like I was a coupon he'd redeemed. Like my $22,000 was a minor inconvenience that had been mildly useful. I took a sip of water. Noelle said nothing. Then Gareth looked at me directly for what might have been the first time all evening and said, "No offense, Lorraine, but you've been kind of a permanent fixture around here, and I think Noelle and I need more space to build our own thing. We appreciate what you've done, but I think it's time to let us be our own family." He paused. Phil was saying the same thing, actually. That maybe it's healthier, less dependency. The table went completely quiet. I set my fork down. Slowly. The way you set something down when your hands are very steady because everything else inside you has gone absolutely still. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at her plate. I said, "Noelle." She looked up. I said, "Is that how you feel?" She didn't answer for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "I just think we need room to figure things out ourselves." I nodded once. I folded my napkin and I placed it on the table next to my plate. I pushed my chair back. I picked up my purse. I said, "Okay." And I walked to the front door, put on my coat, and left. Nobody came after me. I sat in my car in their driveway for about 4 minutes, not crying, just very still. I thought about the Christmas pie. I thought about the gumbo. I thought about $22,000 and $1,400 a month, and $18,000 and every Sunday that disappeared. And then I thought about something a friend of mine told me years ago. The door doesn't have to slam to close permanently. I drove home. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea. I sat at my kitchen table and I wrote down every financial transaction I had made on their behalf in the last 8 years. I had kept records because I am a woman who came up with nothing, and women who come up with nothing keep records. I had bank statements, transfer confirmations, receipts. The following Monday morning, I called my attorney. He is a quiet man who has handled my affairs for over a decade and does not waste words. I explained the situation. I told him about the down payment, the transfer to Noelle's personal account, no gift documentation, no promissory note. I told him I wanted to know my options. He called me back the following afternoon. He said what I had hoped and half expected. Without a signed gift letter, the transfer could legally be characterized as a personal loan. I had not signed anything. Noelle had not signed anything. The money had simply moved. He said the situation was not uncomplicated, but it was not without options either. He asked if I wanted to proceed. I said yes. At the same time, I called the preschool and gave 30 days notice that I would be ending my direct payment arrangement for Bay's tuition. I had been making those payments as a favor with no formal obligation. I was not required to give notice at all, but I did because Bay was 4 years old and none of this was her fault, and I wanted the school to have time to work something out with her parents. I want to talk about Bea for a moment, because I know some people are going to hear this story and say, but what about the baby? And here's the truth. Everything I did cleanly, in a way that would protect Bea from being in the middle of it. I did not stop seeing Bea. I called her. I sent her cards. Later, when the dust settled, I resumed being her grandmother in every way that mattered. But I was no longer going to fund a household that treated me like a problem to be managed. The letter from my attorney arrived at their house 3 weeks later. It outlined the loan claim formally requesting repayment of the $22,000 with documentation of the original transfer. It did not threaten legal action immediately. It simply stated the facts and opened a door to discussion. Noelle called me the same evening the letter arrived. She was crying. She said she didn't understand. She said this wasn't right. She said after everything she thought I was above this. I let her finish. Then I said, Noelle, I sat at your dinner table while your husband told me, in front of his friends, that I was a dependent fixture who needed to be removed from your life. I said nothing. I left quietly. I have been leaving quietly for 8 years. I am done leaving quietly. She said, he didn't mean it like that. I said, then let him say that to my attorney. She hung up. Garrett called me 2 days later, a different tone than the dinner table. Measured, careful, the voice of a man who had looked at his bank balance and done the math. He said he thought there had been a misunderstanding. He said he hoped we could handle this like adults. He said he was willing to sit down and talk. I said, I'm listening. What followed over the next 6 weeks was not pleasant. But it was clear. My attorney and I were consistent. The down payment was a loan and we were requesting repayment. Garrett pushed back. There was a brief mediation conversation. In the end, they agreed to a structured repayment, $15,000 within 60 days, and the remaining $7,000 over the following year. It was not everything, but it was documented, signed, and real. The preschool payments had already stopped. That was 4 months of $1,400 a month that Noelle and Garrett now had to cover themselves. I did not feel guilty about it. I felt like a woman who had woken up. I found my apartment during those same weeks. I had been thinking about downsizing anyway. I was 63, my knees were beginning to offer opinions on stairs, but I had been putting it off because part of me had imagined that Noelle might need me nearby if things ever shifted. I let go of that idea. I signed a lease on a beautiful 1-bedroom with afternoon light, and I moved in quietly, without asking anyone to help, with the movers I hired and paid for myself. I want to tell you about the first morning in that apartment. I woke up before 6 like I always do. I made coffee in the small kitchen. I opened the balcony door and the air was cool and smelled like October leaves. I sat in the chair I had bought myself, a good chair, with the cushion I actually wanted, and I drank my coffee in complete silence and I thought, this is mine. every corner of this. Nothing in this apartment exists because someone permitted me to be here. No one here is tolerating me. I cried a little, not sad crying. The other kind. Noelle and I have a relationship now that I can only describe as honest, which it never was before. She calls me, shorter calls than they used to be, but real ones. She told me once, about 8 months after everything settled, that she knew she had let it go too far. She did not apologize for Garrett specifically. I did not expect her to. But she said, quietly, "I saw what I was doing to you, Mom. I just didn't know how to stop it." I said, "I know, baby." I said, "That's why I stopped it for you. Bea is 6 now. She comes to my apartment, and we bake, and we watch her shows, and she falls asleep on my couch like it's the most natural thing in the world. She does not know the details of what happened between the adults in her life. She knows that Grandma Lorraine has a nice apartment with a blue blanket she likes, and that I make the best biscuits she has ever eaten. That is enough. That is everything. Garrett and I do not speak. I have no anger left for him. It burned itself out somewhere around the time I signed the lease. He is who he is. I was the one who kept funding a version of my daughter's life that had no room for me in it, and at some point that became my responsibility to stop. I kept the records. I kept my dignity. I kept my granddaughter. I kept myself. People sometimes ask me if I regret doing it the way I did. The attorney, the formal letter, the loan claim. They think it must have been cold. What I tell them is this: I had tried Warm for 8 years. Warm got me a Christmas pie I ate alone. What looked cold from the outside was simply a woman who had finally decided that her life was worth protecting with the same energy she had spent protecting everyone else's. I don't need them to understand that. I understand it. Some mornings I sit on my balcony with my coffee and I think about the version of me that would have kept going, kept showing up with food that got quietly put in the refrigerator, kept apologizing for my own presence, kept writing checks for a household that saw me as a line item. I think about her with a lot of tenderness. She loved her daughter so hard that she forgot to love herself at the same time. She thought that if she made herself small enough and useful enough and easy enough, eventually someone would choose her. Nobody chooses you when you cost nothing. That's the part they don't tell you. I cost something now. I know my worth down to the dollar, and I know my worth in ways that have nothing to do with dollars at all. I have my apartment, my afternoon light, my granddaughter's head on my shoulder, and the deep, unshakable knowledge that the life I'm living belongs entirely to me. That's not a consolation prize. That's the whole thing. I think about the woman I was at that dinner table, the one who folded her napkin slowly, pushed back her chair, and walked out without a single word. And I barely recognize her as brave. At the time, it didn't feel like courage. It felt like the only thing left I could do that still belonged to me. What I've come to understand is that every consequence in this story grew directly out of a choice. Not fate, not luck, not some invisible force keeping score. Choices. Garrett chose, repeatedly, to treat my presence like an inconvenience. Noelle chose, repeatedly, to let him. And I chose, for far too long, to keep showing up anyway, with my gumbo, my money, my whole heart, as though love offered quietly enough would eventually be noticed. It wasn't. It never is, when the people receiving it have decided your worth is conditional. But here's what I also have to own. I was not without fault in how long it went on. And that is the part of this story I sit with the most honestly. There is a kind of integrity, a real bone-deep moral integrity, that requires you to tell the truth even when the truth is about yourself. I stayed too long because I was afraid. I kept giving because I thought it would protect the relationship. I confused generosity with self-erasure, and I called it love. That was not wisdom. That was avoidance dressed up in a mother's apron. The clarity came when I finally used my mind the way I should have used it years earlier. I looked at the actual structure of things. I read my own bank statements. I thought about what I had signed and what I hadn't, what was a gift and what was simply a transfer. I had never had the courage to name out loud. Intelligence isn't only about being educated or clever. It's about being willing to see the situation in front of you clearly, without the filter of what you wish were true. When I finally did that, I knew exactly what my options were, and I used them. What carried me through the hard part? The attorney calls, the formal letter, Noelle's tears on the phone, the silence after, was something I don't think I would have had at 40 or even 50. It was a kind of endurance that only comes from having survived things before. I had raised a child alone. I had worked 2 jobs and eaten the same soup 3 nights in a row and still showed up. I had built something from almost nothing more than once. That history lives in the body. When everything went quiet and difficult, I did not collapse. I got up every morning, made my coffee, and kept moving. That steadiness was not a personality trait I was born with. It was built the hard way over decades. Noelle and I are finding our way back to each other. It is slow and it is real, which is more than I can say for what we had before. Bae falls asleep on my couch and I watch her breathe and I think, this is what I protected. Not the money, not the principle. This, the right to be her grandmother without permission, without conditions, without performing smallness so that someone else could feel large. I don't need Garrett to understand what I did. I needed myself to understand it. And I do, completely. Down to the last dollar and the last quiet morning on my balcony. That is enough. That has always been enough.